Hi everybody. We are continuing today through the wonderful book of Ruth in our series Hope for Restoration. But the book doesn't start off wonderfully. As we've already read in chapter 1, we see Naomi and her husband move to Moab as a result of famine, but in the land of Moab, tragedy overtakes her. She loses her husband, she loses her sons, and it really is a terrible situation. So Naomi determines that she's going to return back to her homeland of Israel, and initially her two daughters-in-law follow her. And I'm going to pick up the story in chapter 1, verse 8. But on the way, Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. And in that beautiful passage we read this morning, or read now, we see two daughters-in-law who absolutely love their mother-in-law. Orpah is overwhelmed by the thought of being separated from this the mother-in-law, this woman that she loves, but eventually and reluctantly she decides to do the sensible thing, and that is to return home to her gods, to her family, and to her world. But there is another kind of love that is reflected in the passage we read today. It is a love which is not sensible, but it is the kind of love that brings and opens the door to restoration. It is the kind of love that takes brokenness and failure and rejection and takes all of that and somehow brings redemption and restoration into that space. It is the kind of love we see demonstrated by Ruth. In verse 14 it says that Orpah kissed Naomi, but Ruth clung to her. And this picture of her clinging to Naomi becomes articulated in covenant language that we see in chapter 1, verse 16 to 17, as we've already read. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, if ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Now, what makes this covenantal language quite amazing is that there is nothing that Naomi brings to the party here. There is no benefit to Ruth in linking her life so closely to Naomi. Naomi is an older widow. Her prospects are very limited. It makes all the sense in the world for Ruth to return back to her homeland, and she can do that with good conscience. But here's the thing. Ruth is not doing this for gain. She's doing this out of love. Ruth is choosing to bind herself, to bind her life to Naomi's life, to bind her future to Naomi's future, and she's doing it because of love. Now, there's a type of love that can only exist in this type of covenantal relationship. And the Bible calls this kind of love chesed. That's the Hebrew word that we see in the Old Testament. Now, by far and away, most of the time, chesed refers to the way that God loves his people. But occasionally we see spaces where this chesed love is attributed to people. And we see it even here in Ruth chapter 3, verse 10, where Boaz says to Ruth, "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier." And the word translated kindness in that passage is the word chesed. But here's the thing. The word kindness is totally inadequate to capture the depth and the wonder of what is meant by this word chesed. So what I did is I went onto the web and was researching this idea, and I got some examples or way that people describe chesed, and I'm going to read them to you. Chesed is a steadfast, rock-solid faithfulness that endures to eternity. Chesed is a love that is so enduring that it persists beyond any sin or betrayal to mend brokenness and graciously extend forgiveness. It never gives up. Chesed is not just a feeling, but an action. It intervenes on behalf of loved ones and comes to their rescue. Chesed is love that can be counted on decade after decade. It is not about the thrill of romance, but the security of faithfulness. Chesed acts out of unswerving loyalty, even to the most undeserving. There was a man called Miles Coverdale who in 1535 coined the phrase loving kindness to try and describe and capture what was meant by a word which it is impossible to translate, loving kindness. And it is this loving kindness in Ruth's covenantal relationship that she has with Naomi that enables her to leave her own land, everything that she is familiar with, and to make her home among the people of Naomi. It is this loving kindness that enables Ruth to work in a foreign field, in a vulnerable place amongst men who, as the story unfolds, could be a potential threat to her, but she puts herself at risk because of chesed. It's this loving kindness which enables Ruth to effectively propose to a man that she hardly knows. And then we read in chapter 4 of the book of Ruth that the proposal is not a done deal because there is another relative that she may have to marry in his place, a man that we do not even know, that she doesn't even know. She takes this risk and steps into uncertainty because of loving kindness. Because for Ruth, she is not the center of the story, but Naomi is. And it's for her that she acts. This chesed, which we're talking about, results in people doing crazy things. But it is the kind of love that results in Ruth opening a door for Naomi's ultimate restoration. Ruth's chesed towards Naomi opens the door for Naomi's restoration. You see, that's what covenant love does. Covenant love opens the door to restoration. Now, I was talking to someone the other day about the series that we're doing on Ruth, and they came up with a wonderful description of what we're doing. They said if you take a digital photo and you go closer and closer to the photo until you've only got the 1 or 2 or 3 pixels of that photo. That's what we're doing as we look at the book of Ruth. We're looking at 2 or 3 pixels of a very ordinary life among ordinary people in the middle of nowhere. We sing a beautiful love story in this small space. But as we move back from the picture, we realize that those pixels are part of a far, far bigger love story than we can even begin to imagine. I mean, Ruth's demonstration of love to Naomi is amazing, but it's nothing compared to the love story that is being played out on a much bigger scale. This love story which says that the uncreated creator of everything, Almighty God, is one who lovingly and eagerly demonstrates chesed, loving kindness towards his people. You know, when we think of God, and when that word comes to our mind, you and other people, we have a paradigm that we expect God to be mighty. We expect God to be powerful and omniscient and know all things, and expect God to be holy. But it is not obvious that God, the creator of all things, should be full of loving kindness. It is not intuitive that God would be one who is full of chesed. When we look at the world around us and we look at the brokenness and we see amongst the beauty, pain and suffering and difficulty, it's not normal for us to know that the God who is sovereign over all is one who is full of chesed. We need it to be revealed to us. We need something outside of our natural logic to make us aware of something we could never know with our own powers of deduction. And one of the great things about the Bible, one of the wonderful, if not one of the main stories of the Bible, is that it reveals to us and tells us that the God who is the creator of all is a God who is full of chesed. In Exodus chapter 34, in that beautiful passage where Moses boldly says to God, would you reveal yourself to me? I want to see your glory. God reveals himself to Moses and begins to, in some way, describe himself to Moses. And he says this in chapter 34 of Exodus, verse 6, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, abounding in chesed, abounding in this unswerving loyalty, kindness, and goodness. Not, a little bit of chesed would have been amazing, but he abounds in this, overflows with loving kindness. But as wonderful as those words are, the most powerful demonstration of this being true is reflected in the death of Jesus Christ, where God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Now, when I look at the story of Ruth as well, and I consider Ruth's actions, they're amazing. And they are amazing, but Naomi, there was obviously something kind of appealing about her. There was something about her which drew affection, which drew friendship. We see Orpah and Ruth absolutely adore her. And in some sense, as amazing as Ruth's actions are, there's an element of you which says, well, she was doing it for someone who was evidently a good or a nice person. But when it comes to the way God extends loving kindness towards us, the story of the Bible is that there's absolutely no merit in us which deserves or warrants the loving kindness, the chesed, that God willingly extends towards us. In fact, the complete opposite is the case. In Romans chapter 5, it says how we were enemies of God. We had made God our enemy. We had rebelled against him. We had pushed him away. We had said, we actually don't want you. And yet in that place of us rejecting him and pushing him away, this is what Romans 5 says in verses 7 to 8. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were rejecting him and pushing him away, God demonstrates the ultimate picture of chesed towards us. His loving kindness towards us is secured because of his faithfulness and not because of our faithfulness. Now, the idea of covenant is a very powerful and central picture to the Bible story. And it's going to take a lot longer than we have time for today. But I want to give you a little bit of a brief description. In the Old Testament, we see that God invites the nation of Israel into a covenant relationship with him, where he will be their God and they will be his people. Does that sound a little bit like the words of Ruth as she speaks to Naomi? And what God desires to do is to pour out his loving kindness on the nation of Israel, to make their name great, to bless them, to protect them, so that they will be a blessing to the world. And in response to this, what the nation of Israel effectively has to do is to trust God. All obedience all obedience within the Christian faith ultimately flows from trusting God. And when you did these covenants in the Old Testament, they were quite a big deal. And what they would do is they would take an animal, maybe a number of animals, and they would cut these animals in half and place each half opposite each other. Now you can imagine that in the middle would have been a real mess, gory with blood and entrails. And then the parties of the covenant would walk through the middle, through all that mess and muck, and they would declare what their part of the covenant would be. But they would also say, let it be done to me as has been done to these animals, if I do not hold up my side of the covenant. Now, as we go through the Old Testament, what we see is that the nation of Israel fails miserably and continuously in their side of the covenant agreement. They reject God. They turn to other gods, to trust other gods, and to imitate other nations. They look to the world around them rather than looking to God. But God doesn't let their failure change his faithfulness to his plan of redemption for his world and for his creation. See, God knows that humanity is so broken that there is no way that they could ever be faithful to a covenant with a holy and a perfect God. So what does God do? He enters into this broken world as the God-man Jesus. Jesus, fully God, fully man. And through Jesus, God fulfills all the aspects and parts of the covenant with himself. Everything that Israel failed to do, Jesus fulfills perfectly. He never gives up trusting God. In the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of temptation, even on the cross, when everything would be acceptable for him to give up and to turn away, he keeps his eyes on God and continues to trust him. Through pain and suffering, through good and through bad, he obeys all aspects of this covenant. The result is an unbreakable covenant that is cut between God and humanity, where God legitimately sits on either side of that covenant. God represents himself, and God in Jesus Christ represents humanity. In effect, God cuts covenant with himself on our behalf. And then he invites us to enter into this unbreakable covenant, which can never be broken, by putting our trust in Jesus. The covenant is secure, not because of our faithfulness, because our faithfulness is super fragile, but it is rather secure because of the perfect obedience of Jesus, the perfect life that he lived. That is the security of the covenant. But it's not just Jesus' perfect obedience on our behalf, which is amazing, but he also paid fully the consequences for our disobedience. So remember when I spoke about that as part of the covenant ceremony, the participants would walk through the middle of those pieces of cut animals through the blood and the gore and say, if I do not fulfill my side of the covenant, let it be done to me as it is done to these animals. What Jesus effectively does is he enters into that space and says, let me bear the consequences for their failure to abide by the covenant. On the cross, Jesus takes care of our failure. He makes provision for our failure. But it doesn't stop there. With the resurrection, what Jesus does through the Holy Spirit, he gives us a hope and a promise that we too, one day, will be those who are perfect covenant-keeping human beings, just like him. Even though we stumble and we fall, with the resurrection, we know that one day we are being transformed. We are being and will ultimately be transformed into the image of Jesus, the perfect covenant-keeping human being. And this is not just about being a goody two-shoes. I'm going to be a good person. No, this is about becoming truly human. The resurrection reminds us, it's a promise that we have, that we are being made truly human because of what Jesus has done, because of this covenant that we have. So through Jesus Christ, God has invited us into a covenant of perpetual loving kindness that can never be broken. So as we look at the story of Ruth, which is absolutely amazing, don't miss the fact that there is a bigger story at play, that God is using Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz to weave a story of redemption that finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Remember last week we heard that in Matthew chapter 1, as we look at the genealogy which shows from a human perspective, from the human side, Jesus' lineage, we see that Ruth and Boaz, that Jesus is the descendant of Ruth and Boaz. Jesus, who's the ultimate demonstration of chesed and loving kindness. Jesus who invites us into this unbreakable this unbreakable covenant of loving kindness. Isn't it an amazing, amazing story? May the Lord bless you. May he keep you. May he turn his face to shine upon you and give you peace.